Well, good morning. Welcome to Fairmount Wesleyan, whether you're here in the pews or the chairs with us, whether you're joining us online or in the closed circuit room. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us for worship today. As we get started this morning, I want you to imagine with me that you and I are going to go out and we're going to grab coffee, okay? And this is one of those fun meetings. This isn't one of those serious ones where we have a lot to talk about. This is just us kind of catching up. And we decide we're going to go to the branch, we're going to meet up, we're going to have some coffee together, and you order a Reese's Frap because you know that's the best drink we have at the branch, and you love to have a good time. I'm going to order a decaf Americano today because I'm boring and I want to fall asleep tonight. But we're going to get our drinks, they're going to bring them out to our table, we're going to sit down, and we're going to start having a conversation. And our conversation today is going to kind of ebb and flow like a lot of conversations do, right? We're going to start with the weather. It's really warm out. It's going to be super hot this week. We've noticed that when we wake up in the morning, it's dark out, and we're getting a little bit sad about that because we know winter's coming. Yes. And then we're going to move into what we did this summer. Maybe we went on a trip or two. We're going to share pictures about our vacation. We're going to talk about our summer trips. We're going to plan for next summer together. You're going to tell me the great spots you went to. I'm going to tell you the good ones I went to. And then we're going to talk about the school year. We're going to talk about how it's kicked off, how we're starting new classes, or our kids have an awesome teacher. We're going to tell how the school year is going. And then we kind of run out of things to talk about. And I'm going to do one of those things that pastors get to do sometimes, where we get to ask questions that are really easy for us to ask and really hard for you to answer. And I'm going to ask you a question. And the question is, where is it that you need God? And you're going to look at me for a second. You're going to look at the table. You're not really sure what to say. And then you're going to say, you know what? My marriage is going through a really hard spot. You know what? I took this job that I thought was going to be really easy. I thought was going to have a lot of free time or vacation, and it's starting to burn me out. You know what? I'm experiencing this health thing that I didn't expect. I didn't know was coming. And then you're going to say, you know what? I don't know where I need God right now. I just know I need him. Have you guys ever been there? You ever felt the pressure of life piling up all around you? You ever felt discouragement or defeat or frustration with what's going on? You see, I think that's a place we find ourselves in a lot in life. That's not a place we're in one time. I think it's a place we're in a lot of times. And today we're actually going to find that Paul is in that place as well. You see, we've been in this series called Acts, Community in the Gospel, where we've been talking about the story of the book of Acts. We've seen the spread of the gospel. And we began this series looking at Acts 1:8. I lost my spot. And Acts 1:8 talked about the spreading of the gospel from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria all the way into the ends of the earth. And we followed this one person, Paul, as he's allowed the gospel to spread into the ends of the earth. And so today, that's where we're going to pick up. We're going to be in Acts chapter 18, looking at Paul as he continues to spread this gospel to the ends of the earth. But we're going to see something different. You see, we're going to find Paul is in a spot just like we find ourselves in a lot, where he needs God to move. He needs God to be with him. He's in a God, I need you moment. So again, we're going to be in Acts chapter 18. That'll be on page 900 in the Pew Bible. You can go ahead and turn there, and we're going to jump in. We're going to today read the entire chapter, and we're going to kind of read it chunk by chunk and then break it down. So I'm going to start reading verses 1 through 4 of Acts 18. Let's start with verse number 1. It says, after Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. And so as we get oriented to where our passage is today, again, I just kind of want to remind us where we've been so that we can kind of understand where we're going. Like I said, our thesis statement for this entire series was this verse, Acts 1:8. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. That's what the book of Acts is all about. And right now, in 18, we've seen the gospel spread in Jerusalem. We've seen the gospel spread in Judea and Samaria earlier. We're now seeing the gospel spread out into the ends of the earth. And the guy who's doing that is Paul. If you remember at the beginning of this series, we met this guy named Saul who was persecuting Christians, and he had this radical experience with Jesus that allows him to understand and accept the message of Christ, and he changes his name to Paul, and he becomes a leader in the church. The early church sends him out. They say, you need to go all throughout the world and help people know who this Jesus guy is. And so Paul is doing that. He's carrying out the gospel message to the ends of the earth. In just the last couple weeks, we've seen him travel all over the place. He's been to places like Galatia. He's been to places like Phrygia and Philippi. He's been to places like Thessalonica and Berea and Athens. And in each of these places that Paul has been, the gospel message has spread, but Paul has also faced hardship, hurt, persecution, and pain. If you remember back to when Paul was in Philippi, this would have only been a few weeks ago. He was imprisoned, he was beaten up, he was shackled, he was chained. And then he moves on to the next place. He goes into Athens, and he's there for just a little bit of time. And then all of a sudden, he ends up here in Corinth. He walks the 50 miles from Athens to Corinth. And so as we find Paul today, he's coming into Corinth. He's probably limping and stumbling in. He's probably still bruised up. He maybe has a broken nose or scabs and scars on his face. He's probably limping and has marks on his wrists and his ankles where the shackles were. You see, as we meet Paul today coming into Corinth, this isn't the picture of a man walking into a town in strength. He's not living his best life right now. This is a man in weakness. This is a man in need of God. And the place that Paul walks into, it would not have been an easy place to step into. If you remember, last week we talked about what Athens was like. Athens was a big metropolitan city. It was a place known for thinking and philosophy. We might think of Athens like Washington, D.C. today. Corinth is just as big, it's just as vibrant, but it's way different. Corinth is filled with prostitution. That is what Corinth is known for. And so as Paul stumbles his way into this place, he stumbles his way into a broken and messy city in need of God. And Paul comes into Corinth, and he finds these two people, Priscilla and Aquila. He finds out that they're Christians, that they've just left their hometown in Italy somewhere, and that they are also tent makers just like him. And so Paul starts to work with them. He goes to the market with them. He even moves in and starts to live with them. And they're making leather goods together. They're making tents together. They're living life together. You see, in these first few verses, we see that God is providing Paul a place to live, a job to have, and people to work with. But this probably isn't Paul's dream. I'm guessing if you ask Paul what his dream scenario would be, he's not stumbling into Corinth, he's not living with a married couple, and he's not selling tents. But then we move into verse 5, and we see that things start to change a little bit for Paul. We read, "When Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah." And this probably seems like a really good step. Paul's friends come back, Silas and Timothy. They bring cash for him so he can retire from his tent business. He can go back to the thing that he wants to do full time, which is preaching. But that leads us into verse 6, where things start to change. "But when they," referring to the Jews in the synagogue, "opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, 'Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles.'" So he drops the tent-making thing. He's full-time teaching and preaching in the synagogues. And all of this extra time that he's giving to teaching is also attracting extra attention, right? If he's spending more time in the synagogues, the people that are listening to him are hearing him more and more. They're having more questions. They're talking to him more. And it's starting to create kind of this issue. And finally, the people in the synagogue are so tired of Paul, they're tired of listening to what he's saying, that they start to beat him up, they start to abuse him, they kick him out, they say, "You cannot be here anymore." And as a response to this, it seems like Paul kind of loses it for a moment. He takes off his outer garments. This would have been like a robe or a coat. He shakes them out so that the dust starts to fly all over them. And he says, "You are not my problem anymore. I'm not caring about this anymore. I'm not caring about you. I'm going to change the emphasis. I'm going to change the direction of my kind of preaching and teaching to the Gentiles, to people who might actually listen and respond to what I'm saying. And so then we find in verse 7, Paul starts a new meeting place, which is ironically right next door to the synagogue. It says, "Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized." Paul finds himself again in a tough spot. He's been kicked out of the synagogue, and this is a tough spot that he finds himself in often. Right? We've been with Paul enough these last few weeks. We see that this is a continual theme for him. He goes to the synagogue, he makes some people angry, they kick him out, he finds a new spot. He's working, he's trying, he's straining, he's doing all he can to sow the seeds of the gospel message in this town of Corinth. He's doing everything he can for the gospel to change lives here in this town. And finally, in these verses, we see that things start to happen, right? We see that the spark finally hits. God starts to move. Crispus, one of the synagogue leaders, accepts this message. He and his family are baptized. The church starts to grow. Things are moving in the right direction. And when I was reading this earlier this week, for me, this was the moment that I was like, yeah, God, come on, you're doing something awesome. I was excited. I was kind of ready and eager to see what was going to happen next because lives are being transformed. God is on the move. But it doesn't seem like Paul is feeling that way. It seems like Paul actually needs something else from God. He's seen enough. He's seen God move in his life. He's seen God move around him. He needs something different from God, and this is where God comes close. God doesn't show up to Paul by bringing new life around him. He actually shows up in these next couple of verses by coming close and coming near to Paul in care and compassion. You see, in verse 9, we see, "One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. 'Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city.'" So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. You see, based on what that vision is saying, it's pretty easy to see that Paul was somehow afraid of something, whether it was his safety, whether it was the spread of the gospel message, whether it was his own comfort or his friends. He was afraid of something. He was uneasy about something. But the voice of God came close to him. The voice of God brought comfort, reassurance. The voice of God sustained him, we read, for a year and a half. God didn't meet Paul with a miracle. God didn't meet Paul with an earthquake. God didn't meet Paul with something large or crazy. God met Paul with a vision, with an encounter, a moment where Jesus was able to come close to speak encouragement, support, and truth to Paul. When have you had an encounter with God? When did you sense that he was speaking to you, that he was close to you? When did you sense that he knew you and he saw you and that he was with you? You see, what I have been learning from these verses this week is that it's really exciting to celebrate new growth. It's really awesome to see new growth. But that's not where a sustaining life with God comes from. Our life is sustained from personal encounters with God, where he's able to come close, where he's able to speak to us, where he's able to encourage and sustain us. And so if it's been a while since you've had a personal encounter with God, if it's been a while since you've heard his voice, or you've felt his presence, or you've sensed that he is with you, I just want to suggest that maybe you spend some time this week carving out time and space to be with God. If you're in that spot, if it's been hard for you to have a personal encounter with God lately, maybe today, right now, you need to ask God to be near to you. You want to invite God to be close to him. Maybe you need to ask him if he would provide you with a next step or a new idea in how you can continue to be with him. Maybe you need to pull out your phone and put some time in your calendar to schedule time this week to be with God. Maybe you need to journal with him. I'm just asking you, if you haven't had a personal encounter with God lately, Come close to him and allow him to meet with you. You see, God promised in this vision to be with Paul, and he promises to be with us too. When we come close to him, when we're near to him, he will be there, and he is able to strengthen and encourage us just like he did for Paul. Moving ahead in our text, we see that this encouragement probably helps sustain Paul through this next series of events that are scary for Paul. And let's go ahead and read into them, starting in verse 12. While Gallio was a proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man they charged as persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, God said to them, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things." So he drove them off. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul, and Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. So Paul is taken and drugged before the proconsul of this area. A proconsul would be like a governor today. And the people who take him before the proconsul were probably the same people just a few verses earlier that kicked him out of the synagogue, the same people that he took his robe off and shook the dust on. And they're trying to figure out a new way to shut up Paul, to get him out of the region and the area, to get him to stop talking. And so they take him in front of this guy, Gallio. And they tell Gallio that he is trying to get people to worship their God in a way that is incorrect. As would have been customary in a kind of a trial setting like this, the charges would have been shared against Paul. They would have been read against him. And then Paul would have had the opportunity to defend himself. He would have been able to kind of speak up and share what he was thinking or what he was doing, or just have a chance to defend himself. And so right as Paul is about to speak, right as the words are kind of on his throat and his lips, Gallio steps in and tells all involved that this dispute is an internal matter. This dispute is between Jews about a Jewish issue and Jewish customs that he doesn't understand, and is therefore below his expertise, and he doesn't need to kind of step in. Basically, Gallio is saying that this is a Jewish issue that does not involve Rome, doesn't need to involve Rome. It needs to be handled at the next kind of church synagogue meeting or whatever. Paul goes in this moment from being kind of potentially imprisoned, being potentially persecuted, being even potentially killed, to just being off the hook, kind of like right in that moment. And what we see in these just few verses is that God is using Gallio to protect Paul. God was with Paul. God is sustaining Paul, just like Jesus told Paul in that vision, "I have people in the town that will be with you." He is using Gallio, who doesn't even know him yet, to do something miraculous. God is able to sustain Paul for a year and a half here in Corinth. He's able to move. He's able to use this Roman proconsul to help Paul, to encourage Paul. But then we see, almost kind of out of the blue, Paul's time in Corinth ends. We read, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of sailing with Priscilla and Aquila this week. Remember, we just met them earlier in the chapter. They were from Italy. They're refugees now. They've moved to Corinth. And I imagine that they were working here in Corinth. They were making their tents, and they see this guy stumble into Corinth. They find out that his name is Paul. They find out that he's a Christian just like they are. They find out that he is a leather worker and a tent maker just like them. And so they connect with him. They invite them into their home. They find out he doesn't have a place to live. They say, "You can stay with us." They connect with him. They begin working together. They spend all of their time together. And at some point, Priscilla and Aquila must have figured out who Paul was. This might have been their first meeting with him. This might have been a few weeks into their meeting. This might have been after he'd lived with them for a while. But at some point, they figure out, oh my gosh, this is the Paul that we've heard these stories about. And I imagine that once they figure out who Paul is, that their relationship with him starts to change. As soon as you figure out who Paul is, the way he prays probably matters a lot more. You're trying to soak in how he prays. The way he teaches matters a lot more. You're trying to soak in everything he says. And so Priscilla and Aquila, they spend all this time with Paul. They're getting to know him. They're living with him. They almost start to become a family. And then one night over a meal, Paul comes to them and says, "My time in Corinth has come to an end. It's time for me to leave." And if you're Priscilla and Aquila, it had been a year and a half that you had been with Paul. You knew this was the way that Paul worked, that he moved from city to city, from town to town. But it had been so long, I wonder if you started to secretly hope that he was going to stay here, that he was going to be part of your unit and your family. You were going to get to be together for a little bit longer. And so you're crushed as Paul says he's leaving. You know he has to, but you don't want him to. But then he asks, will you join him on the next phase of his journey? I imagine if you're Priscilla and Aquila, you're maybe a little bit scared because you saw the way Paul came into Corinth. You saw that he was beat up. But you're also so excited because you know this keeps your unit together. You get to be a part of the next phase of Paul's journey. You get to be a part of something awesome. And so for Priscilla and Aquila, this must have been the easiest decision ever, to say yes and go with Paul to Syria. So they leave Corinth, they head to Syria, and we read then that they arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. So they were together for not very long. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, "I will come back if it is God's will." Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So we pick up the story with Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila in Ephesus. And in Ephesus, Paul is immediately back to doing the Paul thing that we've seen the last couple weeks, where he shows up to a new town, he goes to the synagogue, he starts to teach, he starts to preach, and then he gets into trouble. He's immediately doing this thing, and he leaves Priscilla and Aquila behind. And after Paul's been in Ephesus for just a few short moments, he heads out. He goes somewhere different. And what he's doing, I think, actually involves this cutting of hair and this vow that it talks about him taking. You see, when Paul, right before he gets into Ephesus, it talks about him cutting his hair as part of this vow that he had taken. The vow that Paul probably took was called the Nazirite vow. And if you're familiar with the story of Samson, that's probably the clearest example we have of a Nazirite vow. When it comes to a Nazirite vow, this is just a special vow, a special consecration before God to kind of allow yourself to be set apart for a certain time for God to use you. And when you take a Nazirite vow, there's a couple unique things that are special about this that you have to do in order to continue to be on this vow. The first piece of the Nazirite vow is you cannot associate with any grape products. So if you're Paul and you're on this Nazirite vow, you can't have any Raisinets, you can't have any wine, you can't have any Kool-Aid. You can't deal with any grape products. The second part of the Nazirite vow is you cannot associate with any dead bodies. So if someone in your family passes away, you can't touch them. If you go hunting, you can't touch a dead animal. You can't associate with any dead things. You can't go hunting. You can't have a barbecue. The third piece of this Nazirite vow is you actually let your hair grow out the whole time as kind of an indication and a sign to everybody else around you that you're taking this vow. If you have really long hair, you're set apart, it looks a little bit different, and it's easier to remember, oh, he can't associate with grapes or dead products because he has long hair. Then at the end of your Nazirite vow, you would cut your hair off really short, and you would take it to Jerusalem to have this ceremony where you celebrate what God has done as you've been on this vow. So for Paul to cut his hair, it is kind of a symbol or an indication that he was probably on his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the ceremony that he'd completed his Nazirite vow. And so for him to leave Ephesus really quickly only puts that into kind of more of a right theory. And we might think to ourselves, based on how we've studied Acts through a lot of this book, that when Paul leaves, God's activity would slow down. We might think that when God wants to move in a city or a town, that he was going to use Paul. But as we're going to see, God begins to use the people around Paul to continue some of the amazing work that he was already doing. God didn't need Paul in Ephesus to continue to reach the people of Ephesus. He was going to actually start to use the people that were all around Paul. So let's finish out our chapter there and see what God continues to do through the people. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him into their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. So we read just in these last few verses about the success and the growth and the transformation of this church in Ephesus without Paul. And I think it's a reminder for us as we look at Acts, Paul is so integral to so much of the growth of the early church movement. But in this moment, it wasn't Paul who was creating the growth. It was God. And it was God using his people. You see, what I've been so kind of struck with this week is that for the gospel message to spread to the ends of the earth, it needed people like Paul who were willing to go, who knew the Scriptures well, who were willing to teach and lead others, who had this uncanny ability to interact with Jews and Gentiles. But for the gospel to spread, it also needed people like Priscilla and Aquila, who modeled what a healthy and holy marriage looked like, who modeled what it looked like to be hospitable and to open your home to others, who modeled what it looked like to invest in young leaders and correct and disciple them when they needed and encourage them when they needed. For the gospel to continue to spread, it needed people like Apollos, who were eager and willing to learn, who were eager to be corrected when they were wrong, who were ready to go to different places when God told him to go, who was able to speak to a crowd and was able to lead others. For the gospel to spread in this town, it needed the people of the church who were willing to live out what they had been taught week in and week out, who were willing to support and encourage and invest in one another in their community, who were willing to write a letter to the next church that one of their own pastors was going to as a sign of support and encouragement for him. You see, for the gospel to spread in this chapter, God used Paul. But in Paul's time of need, God also used the people that were all around him to continue on the work that God wanted to do. For the gospel to spread in Fairmount, for the gospel to spread in Gas City and in Marion and in Grant County, it needs each one of us too. It needs each one of us to lean in, to do our part, to encourage and equip and support one another as we share the good news about Jesus. You see, at the beginning of this chapter, we found that Paul came into Corinth in desperate need of God. He was burnt out, he was tired, he was broken down, he was beaten. And God met him in the chapter. He met him with an encounter. He came close, he spoke a word of encouragement over him. He promised that he was going to be with Paul, and then he provided people to walk beside Paul as well. He gave Paul a community of friends, of family, of co-laborers who were able to share the load and the burden with him. And so I wonder today if a lot of us feel like Paul. We didn't walk into Corinth broken and bruised. We walked in these doors. We walked in that door. We've got some bruises. We've got some bumps. And we need God. Just like God promised to be with Paul, he promises to be with us too. And not only that, he promises to provide people that are all around you right now to walk with you, to share the load, to carry the burden. God promises to be with us as we go through the trials, and he promises to bring people around us as well. And so that's what I want us to hold on to today. When we're in need of God, when we find ourselves bumped up, bruised up, broken, tired, God promises to be with us, He promises to come close. He will speak words of encouragement to us and over us. And he promises to bring people around us to carry the load, to share the burden, to support us as well. So as we wrap up our time together, I want to invite the band back up today. And I want to close us today with 3 questions for you just to think about as we wrap up this sermon series, or this message, excuse me. The 3 questions I've got for us today, the first one is, where is it you need God? We talked about Paul needing God. We talked about Paul coming into Corinth broken. Where are you right now? Where do you need God? Is there a situation in your life? Is there a place you need him? Is there a situation or a thing that you're wanting him to move? The second question I have for us today is, what is it God might be wanting to say to you about the place that you need him? See, God came and spoke to Paul. He said, I will be with you. When you hold your need before God, what is it that he wants to say to you? And the third question, who might God be using in your life? Who are the Priscillas and the Aquillas all around you that God has already placed there? Who are the people that you can turn to and say, I need help, I need support, and they can carry the load and share the burden with you? So if you want to write these questions down or take a picture of them, you can do whatever you want with them. I'm going to invite us to stand and sing for the last song, and then maybe spend some time this week with these questions.